Hey everyone, I'm rather incoherent, and today I wanted to briefly go over my opinions on the Scarlet Keys, the newest expansion for Arkham Horror. I played through this campaign twice now, once on a blind playthrough where I had no idea what the map actually meant, and then a second playthrough where I was able to make informed decisions and meticulously route out where I was going to see everything that I had missed. At this point, I've seen every scenario at least once and multiple versions of most of the scenarios. And I feel pretty confident in saying that this is a really good campaign. I don't think it's the best Arkham Horror there's ever been, but I do like it a whole lot, and I think it does get better on second and third playthroughs. I do have grievances with the campaign, and in particular, those grievances do come down to some rules issues and some lack of polish and two specific scenarios. And I won't say more than that without going into spoilers, but I will say that one of the huge advantages of a format like this is that rules issues always stop mattering on future playthroughs once you know how they work. And normally, if you have a bad scenario that you don't want to play, that's too bad, you have to play it. But because of the open world choose your own adventure format, as long as it's not the beginning or the finale, all the stuff in the middle you can choose to skip. There's other things you can do with your time. So these scenarios that I have problems with ultimately don't hold the campaign back, they just cease to be part of it for me. Now, before I get into any spoiler territory, I do want to cover two things: the main new rule of this campaign and the map. The new rule is concealed. When you spawn a concealed enemy, what you're going to do is you're going to spawn that enemy in the shadows and end play area that's at no location, and you're going to get a deck of cards based on the concealed card. You get that character's mini card and several decoy minis shuffled together placed on locations. And this represents that character being somewhere you don't know where, and you need to go through hoops to flip those cards to find out where they're at so you can actually stop them. I think both flavorfully and thematically, it works really well, and I really like the mechanic. It is fundamentally random, but to some degree, everything in a card game is fundamentally random. I found that in most scenarios, the fundamentally random nature of Conceal never felt like a bad thing, and there's a lot of room to think about how to maximize your odds with the Conceal that feels like a good skill ceiling and not just random nonsense. But speaking of random nonsense, I do need to talk about the map. This is a fundamental issue that I think a lot of people are going to have with a map of this nature. Do you remember the first time you played Forgotten Age and they told you to buy supplies and you were like, yeah, but what do? And you just had to make a decision without knowing anything? That's what the map is on a blind playthrough. Technically, you can read these blurbs. Not every place has a blurb. All the scenarios have blurbs. A lot of the side places have blurbs. But for instance, if you want to go to Stockholm, there is no blurb you can read on 36L before going there. And when I say blurb, what I mean is on like page 11 for Marrakesh, you're going to see Dead Heat has a blurb. You may read this whenever you want. But then you go to Strange Architecture on 36, nothing. So you get to know, I guess, that it's Strange Architecture because you've read that before you even realize you're not allowed to read, but you don't actually get to read anything about Stockholm. You don't know what that does before you go there. And then even if there's a blurb, well, it might tell you the flavor of what's going to happen. It does very, very little to convey the game mechanic ramifications of what going there will entail. So even if you do spend the 30 minutes to an hour reading all the blurbs and taking notes on what you think they'll mean, you really don't have an informed decision. You just have a lot of flavor text that now tells you nothing. So on your first playthrough, very much the way this works is you go somewhere and something happens. There's not really any real routing to do on the first playthrough. And I think that bothers me as a player more than it bothers most people. Now, getting past those issues that are just inherent to a first playthrough of this, I think the map is really well made. There are only a couple of locations that I think aren't like more or less balanced with other locations, where going to these places is either unnecessarily hard or barely rewarding at all. On the whole, I think the map is well balanced, routing is interesting, you're not pressured into one specific route super hard, and I do really think they did a great job with the map. It's just the sort of thing that on the first playthrough really I don't think adds anything, unless you are the kind of person who this really appeals to directly, and also not the kind of person who gets really into making informed mechanical decisions. So, I would definitely say that I recommend this campaign. I think your second playthrough will be better than your first, and I think your third will be better than your second. But it does have some problems, and there's really no way to talk about them without getting into the spoiler territory. So this is your spoiler warning. If you don't want any, now's the time to go. So before I dive into spoilers, I want to talk about an overall impression the entire campaign gave, as opposed to any specific scenario. In the rulebook, if you check the beginning and the new rules, there's going to be nothing about the Hollow. And if you go all the way to the end and you look at the quick reference, there's nothing about the holo. So inevitably at some point, probably on Dancing Mad, but it could be another scenario like on Thin Ice, you're gonna open up a scenario, you're gonna start drawing encounter cards, and you're gonna draw something like Secrets Lost, where you have to set cards aside out of play as a holo. And you're going to stop and ask what that means. And I know there's a little thing, there are mechanics entirely self-enclosed in scenarios sometimes, but that's not what's happening here. This mechanic is gonna pop up in at least Dancing Mad, Thin Ice, Without a Trace, and the finale. Like 4 of 10 of these campaign sessions, or scenarios rather, use this mechanic. It should be at the beginning or at least in the quick reference. But instead you're gonna have a point where like you get this and you probably stop and look for a rule and realize there isn't one and you move on. And then as you play with it, you're gonna end up having a couple of questions or missing some rules. The biggest one being that the holo is not an area. If I had a card put in the holo and you have a card put in the holo, they're both in the same holo. And that could just not matter at all sometimes. But other times, for instance, let's say you commit quick thinking and over here a Silas already has quick thinking in their holo. There's only one holo area. So if you have another card like the Mimic that attacks you if you use a card that's already in the holo, it doesn't care who owns it and there's only one holo area because it's not for each player. And I'm not sure how many times that should have came up because it only happened once in our second playthrough. But it feels like we probably just didn't realize we shared holo areas and missed that rule all the time. So like between that mechanics problem and the fact that it's just not listed in the rules anywhere despite being used in multiple scenarios, it just feels like an oversight, something that with more playtesting it wouldn't have happened. And it gets a lot worse than that. The 2 secret scenarios feel to me so much less well-tuned than the rest of the campaign that I sort of think that maybe they just didn't have time to fully refine them, and Congress of the Keys is a nightmare. Coming over to Congress of the Keys, let's just set up a version of it real quick. You've got this starting location, but the bigger thing you have is in the book, when you're doing the setup for Congress of the Keys, there are 2 things that are going to happen that are very, very bad. The first thing is for each member of the coterie who voted nay, find their conspirator story asset version and put them into play under any investigator's control. That would be fine if they were part of this story set, or if there was another set that had them, like maybe they could just be in the globetrotting set, right? But instead, note, these story assets are scattered across various encounter sets. Some of them are on the reverse sides of enemy cards. That just feels like an oversight where instead of reorganizing encounter sets, they just like put a rule in here that said dig through your whole collection, which I wouldn't take so badly if it were an isolated incident. But then coming over here, the rules for location adjacency in the Realm of the Outsiders. Quick reminder, the Realm of the Outsiders isn't even in play right now. But like theoretically that'll be a thing later, I guess, since it's telling me about it now. And locations in the shadows can be found on page 57, which is a few pages back. And you should read that because obviously you're going to need to. So you go back to another scenario to read the rules on this. And then eventually you progress the act, that's fine. You go to the next set of locations, and you're instructed to take the concealed mini cards for left, right, and middle, and place them around the bottom, left, and right side of this. We don't need that Medic Nemesis, so you're told to do this. And that's fine. Except this is the first time in the finale for most players, because when you play this the first time, you might see Shades of Suffering, but probably not, and you are almost certainly not seeing Without a Trace. This is what I would think the expected first-time playthrough looks like. Maybe you miss a scenario more or less at random, maybe you trip into Shades of Suffering instead of something else, but almost every single playthrough, the first time you're going to see Congress of the Keys, you will not have yet seen Without a Trace. So these rules are being introduced to you in the finale. And generally speaking, I just really dislike introducing new rules in the finale. This is the culmination of everything we've been learning up to this point where we use it all together. We shouldn't be learning new things in the finale. We also shouldn't be referencing other scenarios' rules in the finale, but what really kills me is the way this deck works is you've got the left, right, and middle up here, and then when you reveal one, you're going to take a decoy, say that said right, drop this one down, shuffle these, and place decoys. You notice what we didn't do at the start? We didn't put decoys down for the first 3 cards in the deck. So you're told in the final scenario to reference rules for another scenario that don't matter yet. Then you get to Act 2, and you're like, wait, this isn't what it said in the rules, right? There should be decoys too. And there would be, and there will be later on. But for setting up Act 2, you just go ahead and don't quite follow the rules, right? And this just feels so avoidable. Like, there's so many slight hiccups with the rules that happen with this, the funniest of which, by far, I saw mentioned on the Reddit. Several people finish the scenario and start reading Resolution 1 here, which, by the way, begins with a dream sequence, so you're not initially sure that you're even in the wrong resolution. And about halfway through the first paragraph, you're like, oh, right, I'm not even in the correct scenario. That's not the correct resolution. And if that was all it was, I would think of those as funny moments. But instead, I think of those as being indicative of the overarching nature of polish in the campaign because of these two scenarios and their issues on blind playthroughs. I don't want to fully review every scenario, so I guess I'll go ahead and give very quick summaries of each scenario. I like Congress of the Keys, but it's something I'm pretty lukewarm on for a finale. It's still a good scenario. But depending on story results, you might have a complete walkover or spawn engaged with multiple boss enemies. And other than that, the scenario always plays pretty much the same. And to me, that feels bad. I don't want the reward for doing the optional hard scenarios to be that you trivialize the final scenario and make it a victory lap. That feels bad to me. Because then I'm essentially playing without a trace at the cost of playing Congress of the Keys. Because when you give me 7 story assets instead of 3 elite enemies, that just trivializes the whole scenario. I much prefer what you see in things like Carcosa, where different story routes just result in different versions of the scenario. You get a different Hastur and everything changes around him. That's much more appealing to me than just change the opening to be varying levels of difficult depending on what you've done. Because then the reward or punishment for certain actions will just be that your last scenario was easier, as opposed to more interesting or more engaging in any way. But on the whole, the only issue I have with Congress of the Keys is the pointless time-wasting puzzle right before the final location where you have to reveal decoys in sequence, and the rules for that are spread across one location, another location, and the act card. That's another example of lack of polish. There's way more instances in this campaign of information involving one thing being split across multiple cards than I think I've seen in any other campaign. It's something that I complained heavily with when I was playing with my friends on some custom campaigns, is it felt like there wasn't nearly as much playtesting and polish, and as a result, you would find information that was split across multiple cards and easy to forget about parts of it and do things wrong. And that happened way more in this campaign than any other official campaign that we've played. Going through the original 7 scenarios, though, the ones that you start unlocked that you're expected to see, I really like Riddles in Rain. It's an opening scenario, it's not that engaging or that hard, but it's a great introduction to the conceal mechanic. On subsequent playthroughs, I haven't found it boring or repetitive in any way. It's not like a one-note, easy scenario that's going to become nothing to you like The Gathering is. It's a real scenario, it's a good introduction. I think of it a lot like I do Pit of Despair, the intro to Innsmouth, where it's just a wonderful introduction to all the mechanics that work in the campaign. Dead Heat and Dealings in the Dark I'll mention together, because they are my 2 favorite scenarios in the set for very different reasons. Dead Heat is the first time in a long time we've just been given a small map with a lot of interconnected locations and told to go at it. And it's also an incredibly hard tempo-oriented scenario with a huge amount of combat and clue gathering. The worst part of the scenario is that on the second act you'll see, oh, it's not the second act, it's the set-aside rescue card. So my issue with Save the Civilians is action, spend 1 clue, rescue a civilian from your location, place it on this card. Because it has to be you and it can only do 1 clue at a time, and you need to rescue a lot of civilians. For multiple consecutive turns, your Cloovers are just going to do this action. In the same way that Miskatonic Museum can be really unfun for fighters because most turns you get to do nothing and then randomly you'll get to find the hunting horror, this is the same for Cloovers. The first half of the campaign you get to play the game and then you save the civilians and that's all you do because someone has to do it and you're the only one with clues. So I dislike that. I would rather see the scenario be balanced with this saying spend X clues as a group so that anyone could do it and then just change the timing and mechanics and other things to balance that, because it can be a pretty boring second half of the scenario for a Cloover. But I still really like the scenario, and especially I like that if you show up late, not so late that the scenario automatically fails, which is a possibility, but if you show up later than recommended, you just start with the boss spawned on the map, which is pretty wild. I know that a lot of people will hate that for various reasons. However, I like being told that tempo is really important. And it's not no setup, because if you do find yourself in a spot where you can't deal with the boss and they're going to hunt over, you can use this ability, Lightning Bolt Move, to get somebody over here as a free action. Everyone else spends one action. You have a turn of setup before the boss gets here. But also, that sort of thing, having bosses spawn on turn 1, that sort of shit is what I really want more of out of Arkham Horror. I understand if you don't like it, but for me, I want scenarios to pose such tremendous problems to you that you're actually going to plan around them. This boss spawning at turn 1 is the same reason that I like Before the Black Throne so much. You go into Before the Black Throne, and unlike every other finale, you buy the cards that are good in the finale as opposed to just the cards that make your deck better. I like the idea that you decide to play this campaign, you know you're going to Marrakesh late, so suddenly you care a lot more about bringing someone who can evade, because killing this boss from turn 1 is not going to be easy, but tripping them the entire game is actually a viable reaction to them being here. I like that you're going to plan your deck around knowing that these sort of tempo pressures exist. Because honestly, this is the only campaign as a whole where I've felt that. It's a big part of why I have good opinions about the campaign anyway. Whereas, legitimately, I think Before the Black Throne is the only pre-existing scenario where I felt like I reacted to the scenario rather than just playing the best cards in my deck. Coming over to Dealings in the Dark, it's good for completely different reasons. When you start Dealings in the Dark, you're just going to have this map here. And for every player, you're going to spawn a cultist type enemy from the deck in the shadows immediately. So you have this immediate time crunch where you're competing to get the clues before the cult, and because of these starting cultists, it's actually very possible to fail. Then, after you do this, this leaves play for a while, and you come down to the bazaars. You enter over here, you exit over here, and when you get to the end, you can find the key and get it. And again, when you get to the bazaars, you're going to shuffle these boss enemies into the deck. There's more pressure points that can arise because of these guys. After that, you get all the map at once now. Everything connects back through, and you're able to run back through. All the enemies lose their conceal mechanics and gain a hunter. They're fighting you for the keys. It's a completely different scenario. The only complaint I have about Dealings in the Dark is that, like, setting up this map is very silly because you're told to remove this from play, so your first time through, you're probably going to take this off the board instead of doing the dumb little trail thing that I've done. And because it's got 3 completely different sections, it can run a little bit long, especially your first time when you're reading the flavor text and you're not quite sure how to do the setup. But yeah, my only complaint about this scenario is that there's too much of it. This scenario is fantastic. It's everything that... What's the Carcosa scenario called? Echoes of the Past. It's everything that Echoes of the Past wanted to be and then some. I absolutely love this scenario. Dealings in the Dark is fantastic. Sanguine Shadows, I should use the caveat, I don't know what the optional final act is. Because to get that final card, you need to make sure that she never successfully steals any of her targets, and that's very, very hard to do. However, it's referred to as a secret finale in the rulebook, so I'm going to go ahead and say that you really shouldn't be judging on that. Especially because, in my experience, it does feel like you need like an S-tier team with good tempo and even some RNG to boot for the first cycle. Like, it's really hard to get that final act, so I'm not judging it by that. I don't even know what that is. But I do think this is a good scenario. I feel a lot like they successfully made the flavor and mechanics line up to feel like I'm trying to stop a thief. Coming over to Dancing Mad, version 1 is like a pretty straightforward investigate with the cool twist at the end with the Spider-Man meme where both Desies are pointing at each other. And it's one of the better things involving like routing being interesting, where you can choose to go to Stockholm before Havana or San Fran before Marrakesh to affect story outcomes. That's all very cool. I much prefer the version 2 though, where you show up too late and you get ambushed and everyone's just in the cafe with you. And if you don't solve the ambush immediately, you're just getting shot by all the gangsters. And then once you successfully investigate and progress to Act 2, they all scatter across the rest of the map. They just book it out of the cafe, and you have to go hunt them down and figure out what was going on. Like, version 1's a good, perfectly fine scenario, but I think version 2 is flavorfully one of the best instances of map movement telling a story, and I really, really like Dancing Mad version 2. I think perhaps more than any other scenario that for me, On Thin Ice is just a scenario. There's one thing about it that I don't particularly like, and it's not the randomness of the locations. I'm actually fine with that. You're going to end up where you find Mountain Stream, and then it places down these locations next to it. And all of that's fine and well and good. But really, you're just like going around random locations looking for the gold mine, and then you go to the gold mine, and then you go back to the locations and you do scouting reports and you fight the boss. Like, it's good Arkham, it's fine. But I don't know, there's just nothing about this that feels awesome to me. I love the bears. The bears are great. The fact that they can't enter the town locations, but they can go through the towns because they know routes through the woods. The fact that they're like 3 health, 2 damage enemies, they just feel like what bears should be. It's great. I love that you can end up in a situation where you're just like in Fairbanks, you're like, we can't go in the woods, the bears will get us. But aside from flavorfully loving the bears and being completely fine with the scenario, I don't have any strong opinions about Anchorage. Well, I have one strong opinion. This is randomly connected to one of the starter locations, so to draw the map accurately, you gotta do this, which is, like, I don't want to ever do this. I do it all the time, but I wish I didn't have to. So I wish this connection didn't exist because I'm not convinced it's even helpful in any way. And like, if my only strong opinion about a scenario is why are these connected, then yeah, I'm just lukewarm on it. It's fine. I like it. I love the bear, but I don't have strong opinions about Anchorage. Dogs of War is like impossible to rate. I don't even know how to rate it because it's essentially 3 different scenarios. You have one version where you're stopping the beast from taking everything. Then you got another version where you're taking the stuff from the Claret Knight like the beast was. So instead of playing tower defense against the beast, you're trying to break into the Claret Knight's tower. And then you have another version, and I guess this is the version where the beast has already stolen the Light of Pharaohs and he's playing tower defense against you from the Claret Knight's starting location. I don't actually know what this one is because I haven't seen it yet. But in all of them, my opinion has been, I don't know, the map feels a little bit simple and not interesting. The objective is just kill these things. The tower defense version is interesting because it's a neat gimmick that's never been done before. And I like unkillable bosses that you actually fight as opposed to unkillable bosses that are just a problem. So while I do like the tower defense version, the other versions to me felt very bland. In the same way that I think Havana V2 is way better, I think tower defense to Alexandria is way, way better. But it's not a bad scenario at all. And with all of that said, that means we're on to the 2 optional scenarios, and this video is about to get a whole lot more negative. Let's start with Shades of Suffering, a title which I am sure refers to the intended player experience of this scenario. I guess let's start with this. You have Act 1, 3 clues that need to be spent when you engage the boss who's currently in the shadows, versus the 3 Doom agendas. So there's a pretty fast clock. Whichever one happens, you're still gonna advance Act 1. If you do this interlude, Act 1 is, or Agenda 1 rather, is gonna go away and you're gonna go back to 0 Doom. Otherwise, you get this penalty and then you do the interlude. Either way, you end up in a position where some new locations come down. You're gonna have the tea shop, the theater, and the tin mine. You're gonna put the miners at the tin mine, the shadows at the theater, and the foreman at, what is this? The station. And all the players are gonna come over here, and you're gonna put the concealed cards for the boss in the 3 locations that have the Geist. Now, the first part of this scenario is really important, because when you get to this point, there's now an unkillable boss enemy blocking these first 2 locations. It's critically important that you've already done these locations, because the victory is not what's important. Like, you want that, obviously. But you need to have done the Remember Founded Sheep Memento, or the Remember Embarrass the Consulate, because this is Wages of Sin. These are 2 different versions of the same enemy. All that matters is, did you trade for a kitten or share a deep pain? And you don't know ahead of time because you're randomly removing one. So if you get thrown over here and you haven't done these yet, you have to get through a boss that is unrelated to them to do them. Ideally, you finish Act 1 and you show up with 2-player clues allowing you to immediately do this. But the real tempo crunch is just that you have to get these 2 done before Act 2 starts. And it's a very hard tempo. You have 3 Doom initially, then a 3 Doom cycling agenda. You have to kill these guys, and if you don't, once 3 Doom has passed, you flip all these over, and if she's at a location with a Geist, she eats that Geist. So now you're never going to get this victory, and when you get to Agenda 3 and you have to fight the boss, every Doom's going to summon back one of those boss enemies. Because they can't be flipped over, it means they're just going to go into display for 0 victory, but you'll still have to deal with them while fighting the boss, and the boss is no chump because you flip her over and you find out that her endless pile of charges on Shade Reaper, even in 2-handed, I had her with 14 on very strong characters. I guess I should mention I've tested both of these with Rex and Tony after playing the campaign twice, because I wanted to see, like, it was an effect of the decks or is it the scenarios? And with regards to this one, it's the scenario. Because this is nonsense. She basically has text that says, take damage equal to the amount you over-succeed by, split evenly amongst horror and damage. It's technically limited damage, but in the 3 playthroughs I've had of this, only once in my 2-handed test playthrough with Tony did I actually push through the charges. She only had 14, and I had Rex use Archive of Conduits to heal enough that you could just tank 14 damage on Tony and kill her. But realistically, most of the time, this is just unlimited damage, and even when it's limited damage, 14 is such a high number that it's enough to kill people. So as it stands, you have like the random Wages of Sin stuff, a lot of boss enemies, you need to go around at breakneck paces to remember all this stuff. So that's all like aggressive tempo and a little bit random, like, because essentially you're gonna end up in a situation a lot of the time where you go down, you deal with this guy who flipped the decoy, it wasn't her. And then you're in a situation where you just coin flip whether or not she's eating a geist. Like, it's very hard to be in a position where you can lock in both of these after you consider the volatility of just drawing the tokens from the bag. But honestly, even though this is a very high tempo scenario with a very unique and difficult boss and a disappointing degree of randomness with this, I really think this second agenda should have been for Doom. Because on turn 0, you deal with one. On turn 1, you deal with another is an incredible pace. But then on turn 2, if you maintain that incredible pace and you haven't done anything wrong and you don't get messed with by the bag, then you can check the last location. It's very hard to stop any of the guys from getting eaten, and you're going to get punished hard for failing to do so, so it's going to snowball against you. Like, it's just a terrifyingly high tempo with a lot of uniquely difficult mechanics in the scenario. However, that's not the problem with the scenario. The problem is the Shade Reaper hidden under the board. Her key says each investigator loses 1 action, and if you don't have a turn right now, that's fine, you can lose it later. That is, on its own, scary. But then we look at the encounter deck, and dear lord, the encounter deck is the reason this scenario sucks. In this scenario, you have total 30 encounter cards. 15 of them are very directly action tax cards. 6 of them are somewhat action tax cards, and the other ones are what you would call normal encounter cards, but they're rough. Because the tempo is so high in this scenario, pretty much every character is going to get messed with minorly to severely by dissonant voices when they draw it. Excruciate, because as I've already mentioned, there are a huge number of charges on the Shade Reaper. Usually is a head 6 test, which means that short of playing a Mystic, this says take 2 damage. Because you can either discard a huge number of cards or take 2 damage, so that's basically what's going to happen to you. Rotting Remains, you know this one, take horror damage. And in Plain Sight, because the boss hits for 1/1, is going to just make you take damage as you expose the boss to stop her from eating Geist. But Bound in Red might make you take more damage. Usually you get rid of Bound in Red right away, but sometimes you roll this into In Plain Sight, and the way the turns line up, you just have to deal with it and you can't do it immediately. So this is like a good amount of disruption and damage, but not like brutal cards. Distorted Reasoning is one of the highest variance cards in the game. Sometimes you have characters that don't even care that they drew this and they just hold on to it for the whole scenario and don't ever commit skills to the test on this because it just doesn't affect them. And then other times you draw this on your main fighter. And like you want to commit Promise of Power to this at that point because your main fighter, every action is fight. And if that's prevented from happening, you have a serious problem. Touch of the Beyond is almost Ancient Evils. 2 and 3 turns, the Doom will matter. 1 and 3 turns, this is a completely blank card. But there is a position on the map where you can sell your items, which may or may not be available, but even if it is, you're still taking an action tax by being forced to walk there and sell your item. Coterie Envoy, being a patrol enemy, will at most interact with you every other turn. He can be annoying, but usually he's not going to be an action tax. Usually this is nothing, but it can be something that forces you to deal with it. So while these cards, all 6 of them, could count against your number of actions in a turn, most of them aren't directly reducing how many actions you get per agenda. However, these 15 are explicitly action taxes. You've got Compulsion, lose 2 actions eventually. You've got Frozen in Fear, which is going to cost you actions, almost certainly, but oftentimes it will only cost you 1 because you know this card exists. You plan to be able to do something about a 3-head test. You've got Bound in Red, which technically doesn't cost you an action, but every time I've ever seen Bound in Red not immediately get dealt with by a stable key, it's resulted in huge amounts of damage coming our way that made the scenario way harder. So realistically, this is an action tax on whoever has a key. Seeing shadows, you're probably spending the scenario at a concealed mini card location, because all the objectives are at those. So this probably says if you have the gall to not spend 2 actions discarding this, slowly kill yourself with horror as you randomly fail tests that you're taking at +2, because this is not an easy set of tokens by any imagination. We have pretty regularly seen the skull at -6, the cultist at -4, you're probably coming here late, so you're gonna have multiple cultists. -1 if there's a geist, reveal another token, or -4. The bag is rough. So if you're letting this stick around with so many bad tokens, with so many locations having minis, this just sort of kills you. Key Charge is our most offensive card. The Shade Reaper makes every investigator lose an action. This does that and then surges into another card. And in my Rex Tony playthrough, I got Key Charge into Spirit Harvest. And I want to be clear, you can't shift the key multiple times. However, the rules do make it incredibly clear that enemies can. This bullet point here, there is no limit to the number of times a key attached to an enemy can be shifted. While a player couldn't do it, Key Charge into Key Charge absolutely does cost your entire team 2 actions. You basically get to skip this round. But you might just lose all your actions, because you can either have everyone take 1/1, or shift the Shade Reaper. Speaking of losing an action for everyone, you're given a choice. Do you want everyone in the shadows to attack you, or for every investigator to lose an action? And provided that she only hits for 1/1 because she doesn't have Bound in red, this is an easier choice. But with so much other sources of damage in this scenario, this quickly stops being an easy choice. That's 6 total damage in a 3-player game. That racks up very quickly. And you end up in a scenario where the boss is going to reflect damage to you, the encounter deck deals a lot of damage to you, your actions are constantly interrupted, and it's just brutally unfun to play. It's absolutely winnable. However, even in my Rex and Tony 2-handed playthrough to see how winnable it was, I had good RNG in a couple of spots. And the big thing for me is that even though they won on the last possible turn, and they didn't get all the victory locations, they still missed something despite being, in my opinion, the strongest duo in the game. So yeah, I think this scenario is not just overtuned, but it's overtuned in the most aggressively unfun way possible. And it feels like it's meant to be an optional challenge scenario. But the upside to an open world campaign is that there's always something else you can do with your time that will be valuable. So if it's an optional challenge scenario that just makes the campaign harder, there's a clear correct play and we never play that scenario again. And it makes me sad, because I want more hard campaigns. I want to see more tempo-focused campaigns. I want to see more situations where you spawn, the boss is there, and you have to plan around that. It's why Congress of the Keys' true ending makes me so sad, because if you know the truth about the coterie, congratulations, we removed all the bosses at the start, and now you just get 7 ally assets. So it's not that it's too hard, that's not my problem. It's that it's random while being more tempo-focused than any other scenario in the game, and the encounter deck actively impedes your ability to play a tempo game. Your best choice most of the time is to hemorrhage damage, and then the boss at the end is going to reflect damage to you, resulting in only a very specific sets of investigators and cards, actually allowing you to win this scenario. Kuala Lumpur was the scenario where I added the don't play this tier to my campaign, because to call Kuala Lumpur bad implies that I will ever play it and have a bad experience again, which just isn't the case. I'm never playing it again, because instead of routing over here, either spending 3 time or waiting 6 days, then going to Hong Kong, then going to Kuala Lumpur, I can just never go to these 3 locations and have an easier campaign that's also more fun. So yeah, now there is a don't play this tier on my tier list that has Kuala Lumpur, the prologue to Circle Undone, and Undimensioned and Unseen, and no other scenarios. Alright, I have been trying to talk about Without a Trace, and I've rambled off topic about it so many times, so I'm going to try to be as fast as I can about this. If you play the scenario with meta knowledge and informed decision making, it's a perfectly winnable, not all that random scenario. Without that meta knowledge, it is a very random scenario with a very harsh doom clock. And the biggest issue it's going to have isn't any of that. This location that you get when you start Act 2 is going to make all the outsider enemies lose aloof. Since there's only a 24 card encounter deck, there's a very real chance that there are 4 aloof hunter outsider enemies that have just been powing around with you for a while. Because it's very easy to just walk away from them and ignore them. They don't really do anything if you do that. So rather than having everyone walk in here and deal with 10 health of enemies that are now going to be like 4-fist enemies, you just have your Kluber wander off somewhere else and get victory points, or contribute cross-map by using archival conduits. There's stuff you can do elsewhere, and even if you don't have anything you can do elsewhere, when you come here, now we have to kill 10 health of enemies. Most characters aren't actually contributing more to the location than we have to make up for by bringing them into the location. And since this guy is in a campaign that has really heavily encouraged foot-based investigating a couple of times, was printed alongside Kaimani, there's a lot of people who are going to be like, oh, it's fine, you can just trip the boss. And then someone can like walk in, do some stuff, and leave if they really have nothing to do elsewhere. There's so many reasons to end up in a situation where your Kluber is off over here, the objective's here, and the resign location's over here, and the Kluber has 4 aloof enemies with them hanging out, not really doing anything. But then you go to Act 3 and those enemies lose aloof. If the lose aloof text wasn't on this, that wouldn't matter. But specifically, these two things combined result in a situation on a blind playthrough that's where it's very normal to have your Kluber get engaged by 4 enemies 2 locations away from your fighter in the wrong direction of the exit. Like, that's just a normal thing that can happen and did happen to us. And that's not that bad. It's a really funny way to give someone a trauma. Except it doesn't give them a trauma, it kills them. Except it might not, see, because you only read this if the agenda flips. If you have every surviving investigator resign, then they just got a trauma. So what happens if you died and someone else resigned, and there was one guy that couldn't get to the finish line and couldn't resign? Well, in that case, each investigator who hasn't resigned, so the dead guy and the guy who couldn't leave, are never seen or heard from again. All memory of their existence is purged from reality. Pick a new investigator. It's better to die. If you go over to the resolution, there's nothing where you read this if you fail to resign. There's no forced reading there. Resolution 1, there's nothing that kills you if you died. No. If you resign and other people are still in the scenario and the agenda runs out, it permanently kills everyone who didn't resign. But if everyone has either resigned or died before this agenda flips, you live happily ever after. So we end up in this situation where you have this crazy lack of polish, where getting yourself intentionally killed is better than trying and failing to leave. Not for story reasons, but just because like there should be a line of text over here where it's like each investigator who has failed to resign is removed from the campaign. I'm advocating for killing investigators here just so that it's consistent to not cause this problem, but this problem regardless in a blind playthrough results in normal play patterns causing the permanent death of a member of the party. So in a blind playthrough, I think this is like the most viscerally upsetting experience in the game. You feel like you get rug pulled and lose a character, and it's only going to happen to some people. Because as long as someone wasn't trying and failing to resign, you're going to be fine. But you know, there is distorted reasoning in the set, so you could always get to Court of the Outsiders, try to resign and auto-fail, and then be unable to resign again. But I mean, that's just ridiculous. That would never happen to anyone, right? So yeah, even though there's a reason to play Without a Trace because of the finale, and even though it's not actually a bad scenario on subsequent playthroughs, the first playthrough experience of Without a Trace is so bad blind that if someone was like, hey, how do you get Without a Trace? I would be like, oh yeah. You go to Sydney and Kathmandu, then you go back to London with the whistle, then you go to Rome, and then you go to the center of the Bermuda Triangle. But also, I'm gonna give you a spoiler, this is really important, you listen to me. In Act 3, they lose aloof. Remember that. Like, I would just immediately spoil it for them. I would include that with how to get there so that they don't have this experience. A while ago, when we were talking about Anchorage, I specifically said that it was good that they were like, hey, hint, when you progress the act, we're gonna summon the boss. Because a lot of the time in old Arkham, you just progress the act, you were like, this is how you win the game, and it summoned a boss, and that sucks. And in this one, I just can't help but think, like, wouldn't it be good if there was like a hint? Enemies will become more aggressive when you progress the act. Not necessarily, you don't have to tell me they're gonna lose aloof, but an idea that maybe letting these enemies hang out is a bad thing. Because we've done that this campaign. So when I say lack of polish, we'd felt that a lot by our second playthrough. But it wasn't until this happened to us that it became the defining thing for the campaign for us. And it sucks that in a review for it, when I like this campaign so much, I have to focus on it so much. Because the reality is that no matter what of these I play in my next playthrough, whether it's all 9 of them or just 8 with 1 of them being left out, on second playthroughs, I don't think any of these scenarios have problems. Kuala Lumpur does. Don't play Kuala Lumpur. That's a bad scenario. Shades of Suffering is a description of the player experience. But the rest of this, there are no bad scenarios on second playthroughs. And there are a lot of really good scenarios, and routing is kind of fun. But despite all of that, even though I'm sure in the future I'm going to like this campaign more and more and more as I play it more times, my overwhelming opinion after the first 2 playthroughs is a feeling that Scarlet Keys was tremendously less than the sum of its parts. That a harsh lack of polish in the latter half of the campaign really aggressively brought the campaign down for us. And that's just a damn shame. But regardless of all that, I do actually quite like the campaign. When I recommended it, I meant it. Even though I've been complaining mostly about these last 2 scenarios for most of the video, the campaign is mostly other stuff. I'm not sure if I'll be playing without a truce again. I probably will, because removing elite enemies from Congress of the Keys is a really good thing to do, but at the same time, that's just not very fun, even though it's obviously really good. But I like that decision's there. Like, do you want to have the routing difficulty of going to without a trace, or do you want to try to find a solution to elite enemies? I like that there are hard scenarios that pose questions to your deck where you have to make specific card choices to deal with them, instead of just making what you perceive as the best deck in general. I really, really like this campaign, and it just makes me super sad about all the little negative experiences I've had in my first playthroughs, but it makes me very optimistic for the future, because those things are solvable on second playthroughs with better understanding of the rules, with meta knowledge, without playing Shades of Suffering. And I feel like I've been rambling a lot, so I'm sorry for that. I've been rather incoherent. I hope you enjoyed the video, despite so much of it must have been me bitching. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, blah, blah, blah. You know the YouTube algorithm drill. And I'll see you in the next one. I'll be starting a campaign of Arkham Horror the Scarlet Keys sometime in the next couple of days. I'll probably post a routing video before then. And when I play this, even though it won't be marred by lack of meta knowledge or lack of polish, it might be marred by lack of power, because I'm going to be playing true neutral. I'm playing Charlie Kane and Lola Hayes two-handed. In what may be the hardest, most tempo-focused campaign there is. So that'll be fun.